Okay, I call the regular meeting of the LaBrae Board of Education to order. Chairman, please call the roll.
Mr. Sewell?
Here.
Mr. Gibson?
Here.
Mr. Morton?
Here.
Mrs. Mansell? Here. Mrs. Dunn? Here. All right.
And join me in the pledge of allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is local right here, but doing this because of the pandemic, so we're doing this on YouTube. And first order of business for the superintendent's report, Mr. Coleman.
Okay, just to bring the board up to date on some developments that have been going on in the district. Obviously, we've been shut down since in terms of class closure since Friday, March 13th. But we're still a business office in many respects, and there's still a lot of activity that's going on. So in the areas of facility and transportation, we did finally finish our hot water boiler repair. We had 2 hot water boilers, and we had a heat exchanger, and one of them needed replaced. We ran into some issues with some plumbing. Naturally, anytime you're soldering and you're putting joints together, even for the professionals, that can be a challenge. A lot of that has to do with getting a lot of the moisture on the line. So a couple of days worth of work, and that was completed last week. Holco Roofing conducted our roofing inspection, and they also completed repairs to the complex and made some repairs to Bascom. Those are minor repairs that they notice a hole in the rubber membrane, or they see something along the flashing that needs recall. Those are the kind of repairs that are covered by that. I will also say that Holco did inspect the metal roofing at the Mod Tech building. There's a section there that they're looking at to put together a quote, a proposal on either repair or an actual partial replacement. Regarding transportation, Liberty Mutual or Landers Lewis Insurance, who is our agent with Liberty Mutual being the underwriters, they reached out to us about taking some of our buses off of comprehensive. Much like you might put a vehicle, we have a vehicle that we put in storage for insurance purposes over the winter, and then we get rid of the comprehensive collision. And then when we're ready to put it back on the road, we put it back on. So that's kind of what we're doing with our buses. We've identified, I believe, 8 buses and have shared with them the VIN numbers and the model, and they have, for the most part, taken them off of our comprehensive coverage. They're still insured. So should something happen in the bus garage, like a fire or a tree or something would fall on them, not that there's any, I think, trees over there that would fall on them, we'd still be covered, but to put them on the road, we could not do it until we put collision coverage back on there. And we will notify them when that happens. From a financial reporting standpoint, in your financial report today, Mrs. Jones has provided you an SM2 report. That is a monthly financial report that will resemble in many ways the way it's laid out, like our 5-year forecast. So you remember back in the fall when we did our 5-year forecast and we were projecting a negative balance in year 3, the state reached out to us in January and said, you need to put together a plan. So we went through that process, we put together the plan, we reviewed it with you. Mrs. Jones, Mr. Sewell, myself, we signed off on it and submitted it to the state. And one of the things that was required by that plan is that we had to provide a methodology for the reporting that we're going to use to gauge our progress. And so this SM2 report is one of those reports, in addition to the FinSum report, that you as a board can look at, and you can track from month to month, what are our revenue sources, what are our expenditure sources, and you can compare revenues to expenditure on a month-by-month basis. And you can see in certain months when we were running a positive, and other months we might be running a negative. So one caveat to that, certain months it's going to look like we're running a negative. And I will give you an example. I can't confirm this completely, but you can look at the month that includes March. March was a 3 payroll month. Plus, in many cases, we paid a lot of supplemental contracts that were waiting to be paid from our winter sports season, with the exception of a few. So you might see something like the first quarter report at the end of March, and it might look more in the negative compared to other months that might look more in the black. And so that's the one caveat you have to look at. There's timing in regards to how many payrolls were in the month, what was the tax collection? Is March a tax collection month? It just so happens to be. So you can see revenue boosted up because we're getting advances on our taxes. And we're also going to see expenditures on the rise because that's a pre-payroll month. Where on other months, you might not have tax collections coming in, and likewise, you might not have as high expenditures because you don't have as many payroll periods. But nonetheless, it does allow you to see on a month-to-month basis revenues and expenditures, and you can see trends and you can compare those trends. And naturally, we can produce those reports in previous years if you wanted to see, how those compare to fiscal year 19 or fiscal year 18 as well. But that is a report that we're providing to you, and something Mrs. Jones is producing each month, and we use it to compare our expenditures and revenues from month to month. And that allows us to help determine if we're on track to meeting our financial goals. Now, I really can't come out of this shutdown period and tell you exactly what the financial gain or the financial negatives are going to be. We know there's going to be some cost savings in some areas, like transportation is one. Even though we're running our buses once a day, that's different than running them 4 times a day. So we are going to have some gas expenditures. We are going to have some payroll expenditures as well. But for the most part, we expect transportation, gas, obviously insurance, as I mentioned earlier, as one area where we could see some savings. Will those savings be so significant that we can ignore the predicament that our 5-year forecast has us in year 3? No, but definitely minimal residual savings from this closure and things like that will help offset some of those negative balances that we're projecting out. And it might help accelerate our plan, but it surely isn't going to result in balancing the budget 3 years from now. We still have to be committed to the financial plan that we submitted to ODE in January. But we do expect there to be some savings, and time will tell how those numbers come to fruition as we work to see the actual final results. Right now, it's all conjecture. 5-year forecast is coming up, and I know Mrs. Jones has begun to work on that. That will be due in May for us to submit it to the state of Ohio. And typically, the 5-year forecast in May is a revised forecast. Those will not be a lot of new numbers, but we will look at trying to update those numbers as cautiously as possible. We don't want to underestimate nor overestimate, but we might try to take into account some of those savings. If we can ballpark a figure and give a cautious estimate, we'll try to build those in. But I would not expect too much to change in that report, like I just mentioned earlier, that will all of a sudden paint a rosier picture. As far as the cafeteria is concerned, we continued. We had that 3-day cancellation of meals. We had some tremendous volunteers coordinate and come forward. Last week, we were able to produce 5 days of meals, producing about 400 meals a day, and distributing that with about 300 being distributed using our 4 buses with drivers on them. And then as well, we're picking up about 95 to 100 meals on any given day here at the high school. So we're filling a need, and we appreciate the community volunteers that have stepped forward to help us complete that in the absence of our cafeteria workers. Sally Deer is our new supervisor, and we're glad to have her on board last week, but it wasn't the best of circumstances for her to step into her new role, as she came into a situation that just wasn't normal. And so she's not even dealing with her full staff. She's got some nutrition group employees helping guide her. This week, Lisa Good will be back on site, the regional director, to help train and coach Sally a little further. But the nutrition group people that were here last week, one is the cafeteria supervisor from Middlefield Cardinal. The other one was the cafeteria supervisor from Maplewood. And they did a great job in coordinating our volunteers and bringing Sally on board and helping us really effectively pick up where we left off without any loss of efficiency. So it was great from that perspective. So tomorrow, we will have our volunteers again in the district, and Wednesday, we expect our regular cafeteria workers to be back on site after their 2-week protective quarantine, if you will. And ODE conducted our administrative review of our cafeteria operations. They completed that in February. We were provided a finalized report here last week, and that written report identifies a few areas where we might have made some mistakes in identifying students who qualified for meal benefits that maybe didn't deserve them. The error was less than 3%, which was within an allowable amount. So it's written into the report, but as ODE noted, minor issues, nothing for us to be concerned of other than correcting and using a better or paying closer attention to our verification process, because we do have to verify a certain percentage of our meal applicants that are for free and reduced lunch application. And for the most part, definitely not significant enough that the state would come back and want some financial, discovery for finding and want paid back to some degree. So we'll dig into those findings with Lisa Good, who filled in for Autumn Bay in that absence as that reporting and review is being completed, and then we'll make sure that we're on the path to recovery. From a personnel standpoint, our mechanics and our custodians continue to report on abbreviated or staggered schedules, and we'll have 3 of our maintenance custodial staff as well as our supervisor being back to work on Wednesday to resume that full slate of employees working those staggered shifts. All of our bus drivers are expected back on Wednesday also, because we had to ask them to stay home in light of potential exposure. So Wednesday is the opportunity for those who were not willing to volunteer for last week to be expected to report back to work so that we can resume our normal food distribution or production and distribution. And interviews started today for our special ed interventionist candidates. I know Mrs. Kowach and Mrs. Frederick were using Zoom to conduct interviews on 11 special ed interventionist candidates. We had roughly, I think I reported to you previously, over 24 total applicants. And once we screened the credentials and evaluated their backgrounds, we selected 11 for interview. And those started today. I think they're going to be held either Monday, Tuesday this week, or Monday through Wednesday this week. I'm not quite sure of their specific schedules. As far as students are concerned, we were, honoring the calendar, trying to do our best to make sure that we took Friday off for Good Friday. Today was Monday. There might have been pockets of some online sharing of messages today through Google Classroom and the like, but for the most part, those were 2 days to wrap around the weekend, the Easter recess, to kind of decompress a little bit and take a step back from schoolwork. We've been handling parent communications via email with teachers and principals and the like. Still working on getting some Chromebooks distributed. We had last week we had Mrs. Powell, my secretary, reaching out to those last bit of parents that had signed up with the available Chromebooks we have, making sure that they knew that they were here, they were ready for pickup, and we're making those available to them last week and this week as well. Some people are calling us back and saying, hey, we're good now, we went out and bought a device, or, a family member loaned us something. So for the most part, it's on an as-needed basis that we're addressing those, trying to make sure that, the families have access to something more than just a phone. Also, we've opened up our Wi-Fi network. I think I might have had you get copied on the phone call that I sent to parents. I don't know if we've had people take advantage of that, but they do have access to our Wi-Fi network. It's 400 megabits per second. That's high. That's a powerful connection. When many of us at home are anywhere from 5 to 10. So quality Spectrum or Charter cable connection right here. It's not the best, but you put a few people out there on a sunny day, if they're sitting in the lawn or in the car in the parking lot, practicing physical distancing, they can get some work done. Last, in the area of students, we've been exploring, and I think we talked with administration and our union representatives about what our school calendar might look like. So we are looking at what a calendar might look like if we're able to meet the hours of instruction through our distance learning. And we do have a tentative plan in place where if we are committed by the state of Ohio, we could shorten the school year. The one big desirable to that is that we have determined that we are going to look at, not waiting this 9 weeks as much as previous 9 weeks. So the third 9 weeks in this semester will be a preponderance of the grade. First semester is already etched in stone, and we're working on trying to find that final resting spot, if you will, between the third and the fourth. But the third 9 weeks will be where a bulk of the grade comes from. So in looking at that, begs the question, how long do we carry on this distance learning if we've met the instruction requirement from the state of Ohio, in light of it being such a disruptive force for many of our students and many of our families? The second component of that is, how much time do we need with staff at the end of the year to collect books, collect materials, allow students to get in, get out, staff to pack up their rooms, collect Chromebooks? There's going to be a lot of housekeeping items that we might need to buy time for. So while all of that is said, and it makes sense, the state of Ohio has not given anybody permission to shorten their school year. So the governor's and the director's executive order is that, as long as you're meeting the instructional component with your currently adopted school calendar, that's what they expect you to follow. So ODE is recommending that nobody shorten their calendar, and until we see further action from the governor and further guidance, we are sticking with the calendar that we have. However, we do have an alternative place, or a calendar ready to present to the board for approval if the governor acts and if the ODE, based on the governor's action, would provide guidance permitting such. So just know that, we're prepared for that, but we don't have any definitive action yet. And naturally, the governor and Dr. Acton's current order has a shutdown through Friday, May 1st, with the first potential day of resumption being Monday, May 4th. But that could always change, and I'm sure that as we get closer to the week, that last week of the current shutdown, the governor will probably issue some additional guidance. Okay? And the only other thing that I would mention is that our current board meeting for the month of May is scheduled for May 11th, and that is it was probably originally scheduled for Bascom, but if we are closed, we'll probably keep that here in the band room, and we probably, depending on developments, if things don't get better and we start reversing if we don't start going down the bottom side of that bell curve, we might want to even consider doing virtual meetings via Zoom. And that's part of our discussion tonight, because I think everybody has seen that. It's clicking on a link. All of you have webcams on your devices. All you have to do is click a link in an email. It brings it up, and you have webcam feature as well as audio. So that is something we need to open for discussion as well, because we'll talk about using Zoom and other facets when we go into executive session tonight. But that is within the realm of possibility, especially if we find ourselves under additional closures. Okay? So that's all I have for a report to the Board of Education. If you guys have any questions, I can do my best to elaborate on.
Will we be able to see the alternate school calendar that you guys have gotten built before? I mean, I know we aren't going to do it yet.
Yeah. Well, there's really no calendar. It's just kind of what's the last day for students. We don't even have technically consensus yet on how many days we would ask out of our staff. So we have a tentative date on what we think we could use for the last day for students, which I don't want to make public at this point because I don't find it fruitful in light of where we are from guidance from ODE. But in the event that that happens, I'll share all those dates with you. The last day for students and how many days we would anticipate using our staff. And one of the other questions, for example, along that line, and you bring it up, and I'm thinking of it, is if we were to abbreviate the school calendar, I need to find an answer if we can continue to feed students as we're doing right now. Because the use of staff, we have to pay them by law. So why not continue to use our drivers and our cooks for a prolonged period of time, even if we shorten the school year for students? Does that mean that we can't continue to feed students as we're doing during the shutdown? Because that would be nice to prolong that out until we have to transition to our regular summer meals site. And to be honest with you, I don't see us having summer meals where kids come onto campus like they did last year. We usually start that the week of the 4th of July. So that's another question that we need to get an answer to before we finalize those things. But yeah, we'll be able to share all those dates with you and all those details.
Would we be able to adjust the food and make it delivery for Somerset as they come here?
That's a great question. It's another question that we need an answer to. And I imagine that could be a possibility in light of what the guidance is coming from the Department of Health and how ODE is structuring that. We'll just have to wait and see. And again, even if we're not, do we have enough money, for example, based on the reimbursement rates, that our program could still pay for it? Because we could budget that into a summer meals program, and we still might have, when it comes to like gas, we still might have some residual savings to cover that, like we're doing right now. So there's great potential for that and to still have it covered by the program. But a lot of gray area. We got to get answers to those kind of questions.
Right now, you're supplying about 400 meals.
Not all of those are delivered. About 300 of them are delivered, and the rest are pickup. About 95 are pickup. Yeah. Any other questions?
I know it's probably going to be adjusted in that, since we are saving on certain things, we're saving, maybe not a bit. Would that affect the way the funding would be applied for next year because of what we spend this year?
That's a big question that's going on in the state of Ohio. Not necessarily because of anything having to do with the shutdown. Remember, in the budget the last time around, the governor froze foundational spending and said, what you got last year is what you're getting for the next 2 years. And then we're going to add some special funding for student health and wellness. Okay, so that's the new money. The new money was for these special programs that are targeted towards things like our school social worker. Okay, we bought our facility dogs using some of that, and we've seen some, games early on that we're not seeing now because kids aren't in session. And so it's things like that we were able to take our student health and wellness money and apply. So until we see a law that would change that foundational funding, we can only assume that, as the governor indicated in the budget, that's frozen. Now, could student wellness funds be cut for next year? I guess anything is on the table, and that's the big question right now. Because you remember early on, during the first 2-week shutdown, the governor in one of his press conferences talked about a hiring freeze in Ohio for state government, and then talked about reducing department budgets by 20% across the board. Well, the Ohio Department of Education is a department. So we don't know what that 20% looks like. Is it just the department operations? Does it include allocations to schools? We're not sure. So the other side of that equation is many of the political leaders in the state of Ohio and some conventional wisdom would say that if there's one area that might not get touched, it's the school funding. Now, when I say might not get touched, meaning no cuts. To many people in Columbus, waxing political, if you will, school funding is a legacy item to some leaders in Columbus, Ohio. And so there's some political wisdom across the state that's saying that fact alone could save school funding, because maybe it won't get targeted for cuts like other departments across the state. And you're seeing, possibly infrastructure programs being funded by the bond market and going into infrastructure bonds like they did under Governor Rhodes. So there are huge question marks around that. I guess at this point, it's all speculation, and anything could happen. We could end up on the chopping block, and we could see that some of those funds do get cut because they might take the approach that, hey, During times of pain, everybody's got to suffer. And so but you might see certain departments suffer less than others. And then the one component that we don't know what it looks like is tapping into Ohio's $2.7 billion rainy day fund. Okay? The Kasich administration through the Ohio General Assembly, I read an article today that said if it wasn't for the legislature raising the cap on how much money you could put into the rainy day fund, and it was the old 5% of general fund revenues, you'd be sitting at $1.7 billion in the rainy day fund and not $2.7 billion. So because of the Kasich administration and the Republican legislature raising that cap over the last administrative 8 years, that has put Ohio in a much better footing to address this rainy day. So we'll just have to see how all that flushes out over the next 5 to 6 months.
This is a rainy day, I don't think.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is we're seeing the news coverage flip a little bit. I've noticed over the last couple of days, there's less talk about deaths and number of cases increasing, and the talk is turning to when do we reopen the country? Yesterday and today, that's been a lot of the coverage. Now, I'm not saying that's right, but that's the preponderance of the coverage. And so the governor today in his press conference addressed how measured Ohio will take an approach to gradually opening back up. I think the conventional wisdom as you listen to the coverage today in print and in the television media is that we might not expect this measured opening to occur until May. So what that looks like, we'll see. Because I think everybody recognizes that, are we turning a corner? And if we are, what does that mean for reopening? So we'll just have to keep our eyes on that. Okay, anything else?
Any other questions? All right, we can skip public participation. Nobody's here, they're allowed to be here. It's just us. And all right, we'll go to our regular agenda items. A couple of these I know there's longer statements here we have to go through, but a lot of legal formalities. Hopefully Mr. Calderon will be able to get.
Yes.
Turn it back over to you, we'll go into the regular agenda items.
Okay, so one of the things that we did is put this resolution at the front because the very first resolution that you're addressing as a board, it's going to revolutionize legally how we can adapt to public meeting laws in the state of Ohio and some of our own bylaws. So you have a lengthy resolution that is based on the governor's executive order and our state of emergency and the House Bill 197, which was the emergency legislation passed by the General Assembly and signed practically immediately into law by the governor. And a lot of what this resolution does is it allows us to suspend certain policies and adopt the premise of what House Bill 197 permits, which is to hold a public meeting without the public present. To do it via teleconference, or to do it like we're doing tonight by using YouTube Live and making sure that we're, to some degree, being practicing some fidelity to transparency by broadcasting it. So an example for, we have a bylaw on public participation. Well, this resolution, when you go to pass it, will allow us to suspend that. So that we don't have to permit public transportation in light of the state of emergency in Ohio, the governor's executive order, and House Bill 197. So this was prepared by legal counsel, and as a result of it, when you adopt it, it's going to protect the board so that we are in compliance with public meeting laws and board policies by making the appropriate suspensions and allowances that keeps us legal as we conduct business between now, or actually at the time the governor issued the order, and December 1st. So come December 1st, as a worst case scenario, if this stuff isn't resolved, the legislature would have to come back and pass some additional extensions to permit public bodies like boards of commissioners and boards of education to be able to continue to do business this way. Okay, so it is recommended that the Board of Education approve the resolution that you have before you, and then instead of reading all the justification there, I will just add where it says, be it further resolved that pursuant to House Bill 197, the board shall conduct its meetings either by a combination of in-person attendance while maintaining social distancing, electronic or virtual attendance, or solely by electronic or virtual means for the duration of the declared emergency, but not beyond December 1st, 2020, unless the period of emergency is extended beyond that date. Be it further resolved, the board hereby suspends its policy 169.1 on public participation at board meetings. Be it further resolved, the board hereby suspends relevant provisions of its policy 100, the definition of voting, with regard to being physically present in order to have a member's vote officially recorded. Policy 162, which governs what the quorum is needed for a board with regard to being present in person for purposes of a quorum. Policies 166, which is about executive session, and 167 on voting with regard to all in-person requirements, and relevant portions of its policy 131, legislative, with regard to being physically present, and any and all board policies and procedures in conflict with the resolutions herein and/or House Bill 197 for the purpose of compliance with Ohio's Open Meetings Act for the duration of the declared emergency, unless the period of the emergency is extended beyond the date. Be it further resolved that the board president, the superintendent, and/or treasurer are authorized and directed to take all such other actions as are necessary or appropriate to accomplish the objectives of this resolution. And be it further resolved that it is hereby found and determined that all formal actions of this board concerning and relating to the adoption of this resolution were adopted in an electronic meeting of this board in compliance with all legal requirements, including House Bill 197, and as permitted by Ohio law. And be it further resolved that this resolution shall take effect and be enforced from and after the earliest period allowed by law. We need your approval in order for us to be compliant with how the board might have to change how we do official business.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Morton, second by Mrs. Duncan. Any discussion? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan? Yes. Mrs. Van Sal?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
The next item on the agenda is a recommendation the Board of Education approve the minutes from its March 9th, 2020 regular board meeting.
So moved. Second.
Motion by Mr. Gibson, second by Mr. Morton. Any discussion? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mrs. Van Sal?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan? Yes. Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Next item on the agenda is a recommendation that the Board of Education approve the March financial report as presented by the treasurer.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Ansell, second by Mr. Morton. Any discussion? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Van Sal?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan? Yes. Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Next item on the agenda is a recommendation that the Board of Education approve the payment of March bills as presented by the treasurer.
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Duncan, second by Mr. Gibson. Any discussion? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Duncan? Yes. Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mrs. Van Sal?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Next item on the agenda is a recommendation that the Board of Education acknowledge the receipt of bids for the Bascom Elementary office remodeling project from United Contractors Incorporated.
So
Second.
Motion by Mr. Morton, second by Mrs. Ansell. Any discussion? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mr. Morton?
yes.
Mrs. Van Sal?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan? Yes. Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Next item on the agenda is a recommendation that the LaBrae Board of Education reject the bid from United Contractors Incorporated for the Bascom Elementary office remodeling project.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Morton, second by Mrs. Duncan. Any discussion?
I did hear from the architect today. Mr. Cook emailed me late afternoon. I haven't had a chance to reply back to him. We'll touch base tomorrow. He reached out to the contractor to discuss some parameters of why their bid might have been higher than we expected. Some of it had to do with some of the old glazed block in that building, the finished block that is glazed, how expensive it is to replicate that material. They're looking at some adjustments to some plans and how we might alleviate that, change some of the fill product rather than trying to match it up perfectly. We had had some discussion with regards to other interested bidders that we thought would possibly submit bids that didn't. So I'll follow up with him tomorrow to have hopefully some information revealed on to what the status is on how we extend that bid window so that we can expedite that process and see if we can revise it and come up with some fine tuning of that bid.
We did have like 4 or 5 other people that actually came in and looked at the project. But that's what he was gonna check to see why they didn't do it all. I'm not sure. Unless they were busy, maybe they were restricted under the new guidelines, I'm not sure.
And that is one of the things that Mr. Cook had kind of pointed out, that maybe some of the people that expressed interest that had looked at the plans were scared off because of the governor's 2-week shutdown, and they thought that you couldn't have a construction project. He informed us at the bid opening meeting that the governor's order does permit this project to go forward because it would be considered a public works infrastructure program. And his connection was that if they weren't aware of that, they might have been afraid about the timeline guarantees that they would have had to meet, and therefore were scared off from submitting a bid. So in light of that, we felt that it was best to extend that window and see if we can sharpen it up, and then also maybe have some resubmittals or some initial submittals along those lines. So.
Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan? Yes. Mrs. Mansell?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Stoll?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Next item on the agenda is a recommendation that the Board of Education approve a 30-day unpaid short-term leave of absence for classified employee Diana Castor effective Thursday, April 6th, per Article 7 of the negotiated agreement with OPC Local 278.
So moved. Second?
Motion by Mrs. Duncan, second by Mrs. Mansell. Any discussion? Just one. I know a lot of you probably know some, but when you circle, glad that there wasn't any injuries. And that they've got a lot of work to do. So I know she needs some time off to get her get everything back. Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Duncan? Yes. Mrs. Mansell? Yes. Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Stoll?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Next item on the agenda is a recommendation the Board of Education employ Melissa Wilfu as a school counselor for grades 6 to 9 on a 1-year limited contract effective August 21st, 2020.
So moved. Second?
Motion by Mrs. Mansell, second by Mrs. Duncan. Any discussion? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Mansell? Yes. Mrs. Duncan? Yes. Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Stoll?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Next item on the agenda is a recommendation the Board of Education approve the following resolution, which is before them. And this resolution is kind of an after-the-fact resolution because we did not participate. We did not participate in the original bus bids. So basically, this resolution saying that since we are a member of the Trumbull County Educational Service Center, and the Trumbull County Educational Service Center participated in the Ohio School Council bus bids that were conducted on October 18, 2019, that we are therefore approving this resolution, which as a residual effect, we can participate in that bus bid process that concluded in October. Okay, so with your approval, much like we did last year, this will authorize us to take advantage of that bid process through the Ohio School Council via our membership and affiliation with the ESC and the ESC's membership in the Ohio School Council.
So moved.
Second. Motion by Mrs. Mansell, second by Mr. Ward. Any discussion?
Okay, and just remember, we weren't gonna buy a bus. It's not in our 5-year forecast. We will put it in our revised 5-year forecast. But what the state of Ohio did in the last budget, and this is money that's not going anywhere because it's already been allocated. The state of Ohio put $20 million towards school districts for bus purchasing assistance. And then they instructed ODE to figure out how to distribute that. So one of the things they did is they base it on your state share index. It's a measure of your local wealth and capability. And then whatever that wealth and capability is, that's how they fund us when we're under a typical model. The state kicks in a certain percentage based on our own wealth. Our state share index is 67%. So what ODE did is they looked at all the bus purchases and determined that the average bus cost is about $88,000 in the state of Ohio. Maybe it was 86. And then using our state share index, that's how much money they're going to allocate to us. So we're going to get about $57,000 from the state. We have to make up the difference. And as I noted to the board earlier in a prior written correspondence, when Mrs. Jones and I talked about that, we thought, how do you pass that up? Even though it's not in the budget, and we know we're going to need to resume bus purchasing in 2 years, maybe we need to accelerate that by 1 year and have to allocate, $26,000, $27,000 in order for us to make that purchase. So some of the savings we might experience in transportation this spring could offset that. So I mean, that's kind of how you wrap your head around that additional expense. But it's an expense we feel we have to build into our revised 5-year forecast, take advantage of what the state's offering us, because our bus fleet is not getting any younger. We have buses on the road that are from 2001. A couple of them are great buses, but they can go at any moment, all right? So we're waiting on a bus quote from Myers. Myers is one of the responsible bidders in this bid process, and once they submit a bus quote to us, we'll review that and see if it's within our typical spending realms of previous bids and move forward with your approval in hopefully May's meeting, because we have to submit that bus quote to ODE by May 20th. So Myers and my office have been in contact, and we'll continue to be in contact as April closes if we're not in receipt of quote. Okay?
Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Pascal?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes. Motion carries 5-0.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is a recommendation the Board of Education approve the resolution permitting distance learning. Now, I'm not going to go through this resolution other than to summarize what we have to do. So, you might recall that several years ago we had a full-throated discussion, if you will, as a board about, are we going to do distance learning, i.e. blizzard back? And our board at the time had said, there's nothing more valuable than having teachers in front of students, facilitating and instructing. That wisdom is probably proving true. While distance learning can be effective in some regards, there's nothing quite like face-to-face contact and instruction and facilitation. And so our board has made a decision that, if we miss too many days of school, we're not going to do distance learning. We're not going to do the 3 blizzard bags. Well, one of the things that happened in House Bill 197 is the state removed the 3-day cap on blizzard bags, or i.e. distance learning, and said you can use as many days as you like. So in order for us to take advantage of all the distance learning that we've been doing since March 13th, we need to pass this resolution to permit that. When we do that, then we'll have to identify with the state what our plan for distance learning is, and then we'll be in compliance with new state requirements to count all these hours that our students have been engaged as hours of distance learning, allowing us to meet and use distance learning to meet our hours of instruction mandate. Okay? So with your approval tonight, we'll be in compliance with the state's distance learning guidelines under prior state law, as well as current state law with emergency legislation as identified in House Bill 197.
So moved.
Second. Motion by Ms. Van Sel, second by Mr. Morton. Any discussion? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Pascal?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes. Motion carries 5-0.
Next item on the agenda is a recommendation to the LaBrae Board of Education to approve the following resolution, which will declare evaluations impractical and impossible. And this one I'm going to go ahead and read. So whereas Section 17M of amended substitute House Bill 197 of the Ohio General Assembly permits a Board of Education to elect not to conduct evaluations of teachers and administrators under Chapter 3319 of the Ohio Revised Code for the 1920 school year, based on a determination that it would be impossible or impractical to do so. And whereas the board desires to make such an election for the 1920 school year, now therefore be it resolved that the board finds that it would be impossible or impracticable to conduct evaluations of teachers and administrators pursuant to Chapter 3319 of the Ohio Revised Code for the 1920 school year, if said evaluations were not completed prior to the Ohio Director of Health's order on March 14, 2020, ordering the closure of K-12 schools in Ohio. Be it further resolved that the board elects not to conduct evaluations under Chapter 3319 of the Ohio Revised Code for teachers and administrators during the 2019-20 school year, to the extent that such evaluations were not completed prior to March 14, 2020. And being that we have not completed fully our evaluation process, many observations, many of the walkthroughs are completed, but we do not have evaluations fully completed. The only two evaluations that were thoroughly completed were the treasurer and the superintendent. And so therefore, it's kind of impractical. It's impossible to complete those evaluations with fidelity. And as a result, I'm recommending that the board adopt this resolution, permissible by House Bill 197, that would forego the evaluation process for teachers and administrators for this current school year.
So moved. Second.
Motion by Mrs. Duncan, second by Mrs. Ansel. Any discussion?
What are the guidelines of this evaluation? I mean, is it certain things that this Chapter 3319 of the code says that they are looking at for these evaluations? Because what was going through my mind is this is a good time, if you've all seen the postings of the teachers with their files and how they present it, and some are excellent, some not so excellent, that maybe the administrators could evaluate, give some guidelines, standardize a little bit of what they should be putting in, and then evaluate them on how they present that stuff online. Is that a possibility, rather than just getting totally rid of evaluation, but give them some guidance as to how and what to post in these files so that the kids at home are understanding what's required of them. It's just something that, I mentioned last year, and one of the parents on the Zoom last week was talking about it as well on that meeting about not knowing a lot of times what the kids are required. And I think this will be an opportune time for the principals to go in and tell their staff, this is, set a template of some minimum standards, this is what we would like, and then, kind of try and coordinate. I know it's not really, it might be better with one of the professional days, like the very first one in school, to actually sit down with the staff and go over that. But I'm just saying, that's an evaluation process that the principals be doing at this time to help their teachers along.
Sure. Well, I wouldn't want anyone to think just because we're not having an evaluation or we're not putting something like this in an evaluation, that those conversations aren't happening. I think we have to be careful about taking the circumstances of this spring and going 0 to 60 on evaluations and saying X isn't happening across the board, so let's put it in the evaluation or let's put it in an improvement plan right now. Where we've had, 4 or 5 years of OTES evaluations, and we haven't handled those situations that way. So I think a lot of times what our administrators try to do in their formal observation pre-conferences and post-conferences is they've identified the teaching standards according to the rubric in the OTES evaluation, and they have conversations around those standards in terms of, is there an appropriate level of planning of student data that is focused on improving instruction and improving student outcome. That's an example of one that would be under what you would call the continuous improvement standard of the teaching rubric. Or they might look at the professionalism rubric and some components of that. And so there are, in fact, one of the things we did at the beginning of the outset of OTEST is we said there are so many bulleted points in this rubric that we don't want administrators and teachers feeling they have to talk about every one of them. So typically what our principals do is they provide that bulleted list to the teachers that they're going to have a pre-conference with and say, I want you to focus on, when you come to the conference, I want to talk about items 1, 2, and 3, and wherever they identify. So those are ongoing conversations, and just because we are doing something different, and let me say that public educators across the state of Ohio turned on a dime quicker than many professionals across the state in other areas could. Some of the things that you bring up are sometimes more of a communication issue, because a parent might reach out to me in an email and say, how can my A or B student be not getting the grade? And I looked at the report card, but I could not see what the parent was seeing. So I replied to the parent and said, I don't see what you're seeing. You're going to have to reach out to the principal and the teacher. According to the principal, that issue was resolved because the student had done the work, but they didn't, quote unquote, submit in Google Classroom. So you can see through Google where the work was done, but it wasn't a submission, and that particular issue revolving that parent that you're referring to, as I followed up on it, was something that was corrected. Now, it underscores the point that the parent wanted, which was something more uniform. Now, you could desire to have things very uniform. I think conversations are happening between our teachers and our principals by building, not K-12 uniformity, about how we want things to look and how we want to make sure that we're not ignoring those who are not digitally connected, so that we can try to provide some level of consistency. And because of the newness of this, so that it makes sense about what I'm trying to say, I wouldn't want anyone to think that our principals and our teachers aren't having those conversations, that they haven't had that guidance. And two, I wouldn't want us to be practicing to where something is so new for us that when things aren't maybe happening to some level of uniformity, that we're putting them right now into the evaluation process, because I think that's a very high expectation. And it sends the wrong message that we're not accomplishing something in such a new and short window of time frame, but we're going to rush to put it into your improvement plan or evaluation. Now, what I would say should happen as we move forward is that by turning on a dime so quickly as a district, if we have teachers that come back and they don't take advantage of what they've learned in such a short period of time, and they abandon the quality that exists in distance learning, then shame on them as professionals. Because our expectation as a district ought to be, what did we learn from this? How can we enhance instruction? How can we help students advance 21st century skills through collaboration and using technology and using the skills that we exposed ourselves to? What can we learn to make ourselves even better? We learned some things in a short period of time, but now we've got to raise our game and take it to the next level so that we can reach more students. So what can we do from an instructional standpoint? And you might recall, as a board, back in February, we were talking about our tech survey, grades 6 to 12, with our students about closing that digital divide. Then we have to do our job and close that digital divide by providing access to hotspots for checkout, so that when teachers do try to take this distance learning and give access to every kid, regardless of what their digital connectivity is, we have ready devices available for checkout. It changes our multimedia center. We're no longer just a library. So while I respect what you're saying from a standpoint of, are there conversations to be had about how we create uniformity, some common expectations about how we do distance learning, and the ESC and professional development days are going to be a part of that. Because the ESC, even as we speak, has created over the last month professional learning days. And they even sent out attendance to all superintendents today. They said, we've had these weekly professional development Zoom sessions where we're addressing things at all content levels and grade areas because they want to do their best to make sure teachers are up to speed as they help teachers learn, because they know teachers are a little bit of a disadvantage. Many of them are across the county. Here's what your attendance looks like. And so we can see how many LaBrae teachers have participated in those meetings. I can't hold it against our teachers that we aren't getting 100% attendance. Okay, we're in the double digits, but we're not 85 professionals participating. But quite frankly, we shouldn't be, because some of our teachers are still trying to wrap their head around keeping up and how do I diversify this lesson and how do I find the balance between review and new material and then trying to make it keep up with the grading and the assessment component. So I just think for those reasons we have to be careful about how much teeth we give those conversations. And I think throwing them immediately into any evaluative process in a formal written manner, one, jeopardizes the relationships that we're going to have, and that hurts future conversations when we do want to have serious conversations with teachers about, are we effectively engaging students in distance learning, and what are we taking from what we learned in the spring and trying to incorporate? So I think we have to use a measured pace about how we go about that. But I think the spirit of what you're saying is spot on, because we've got to have some conversations about uniformity. What's the quality? What's it look like? What do we learn? How do we properly support our teachers in professional development so that we don't just abandon what we've accomplished this spring and throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak? Because there are some things that we could do without, but there's some things we can't just turn our back on and say, okay, let's go back to the way we used to do business, because that's not good either. So I just think we got to be a little careful about how we have those conversations. But very good.
Yeah, well, I wasn't sure about throwing everything out, but
Yeah.
with some kind of minimal standards that everyone should have incorporated in there. And then they can add more, build more, according to their class or their the level of the student. But some minimal standards that everybody should have in
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I think I know from prior conversations what some of those are, and I know from recent conversations that we had in that Zoom session what those might be. Well, those conversations are still going to be forthcoming for sure. Thank you. That's a very good point.
Any questions? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Duncan?
Yes.
Mrs. Mansell?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Okay, next item on the agenda is a recommendation of the Board of Education acknowledge and accept the following donations. I know Mrs. Lutz had several donation boxes located within the community. A couple of them were dials, one was at Circle K. She also organized the GoFundMe fundraiser to pay for student debt. And most recently, she submitted a check to the treasurer's office of the money that was in those donation boxes, and there was $330, and that money will go towards paying down lunch debt. Also, we acknowledge food pantry donations in the amount of $500, $100 from Shirley Bacon towards Bascom Elementary's food pantry. We have the Graceville United Methodist Church donated $200, and the Beck family donated $200 as well. We graciously accept those donations, and we are grateful for them, as we know that our food pantry is a tremendous service to our community.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Duncan, second by Mrs. Mansell. Any discussion? And we do appreciate that, especially at this time, you all every day. Appreciate that. Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Duncan?
Yes.
Mrs. Mansell?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is a recommendation the Board of Education approve the following use of facility requests. And of course, every year, our Scout Alumni Association wants to hold their annual craft show. So the 27th annual LaBrae craft show is scheduled for Saturday, November 7th, and they have submitted their facility use request. And again, that is for a fee. So they pay to use our facility, and we cooperate and schedule around them. We need your approval to finalize that agreement.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Ansell, second by Mrs. Duncan. Any discussion? Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mrs. Mansell?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Morgan?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0.
And then, of course, the last resolution we'll come back to, but we've got some other items there before we exit public session.
All right, we move the concerns of the board. Mr. Warden? Nope. Mr. Gibson?
No.
So,
I just want to say the teachers and stuff on their turnaround and the short notice has been really good. From the high school perspective, they're doing a lot of FaceTime, Zoom time, so my kids are still getting teacher time, which has been really important to them. It's kind of been like a grieving process. They were told, one day was normal and the next day, they're teaching everybody's done. So I want to say kudos to our staff and what we're getting and technology-wise, and we have struggles, but we're making it. So it's a good news.
I just want to add praise to the staff for the adaptation of the distance learning. I know it was a big, you said big turnaround, and we're trying to get a hold of all the students we can. I know there's still some out of the loop, like you said, with technology and that. We're trying to address that. We really do appreciate all the volunteers we have, especially for the meals, because I know some of the students, that was all they had. And we do need to stay in touch with them, because some of them come from broken homes, and school was a safe place. So I pray for them to stay safe and stay healthy, and just keep the faith, and hopefully this will be over soon, and we can get back to semi-normal. Yes, what we have to do next, we need to go into executive session. And you have a motion to go into executive, discuss collective bargaining and employment of personnel.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Gibson, second by Mrs. Mansell. Remember, there will be no voting in the executive session. We will come out in a regular session after the executive, and we will adjourn at that time. Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mrs. Mansell?
Yes.
Mrs. Duncan?
Yes.
Mr. Morgan?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
Yes, motion carries 5-0. Go into executive session at 7:05.
Okay, and just for the sake of the public recording, so that anybody who might be viewing this online, do know that when we shut down the recording, we will not resume it when we come out of executive session. I do want to reiterate the words of President Rusty Sewell, the board, who said there's no voting in executive session. And when they come out of executive, there will be no action. There will be one vote taken to adjourn the meeting. Okay, this concludes the public broadcast portion of the LaBrae Board of Education meeting on April 13th, 2020.